This is a CBC podcast. Podcasts. Man, there are so many of them out there. Hit it! Podcast Playlist collects, selects, dissects the best. Podcast Playlist with hosts Matt Galloway and Lindsay Michael. Find it at cbc.ca/podcast playlist or subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast app.
Hey, I'm Rosemary Barton, and this is the At Issue podcast. On the panel today, Andrew Coyne of the National Post, Chantal Hébert of the Toronto Star, and Paul Wells of Maclean's. The Auditor General came out with his annual report this week, and we're talking about his dire assessment of the Phoenix pay system, the problem with the provinces when it comes to the Liberal housing strategy, and finally, an ice rink on Parliament Hill to the tune of $5.6 million. And you can't even play hockey on it.
I can say it's unacceptable, but unacceptable just doesn't capture the seriousness of this issue. So I think perhaps the best way that I can put it is, in my opinion, this really has to be the government's main priority to get this resolved.
Main priority, some strong language there from Auditor General Michael Ferguson. That was on Tuesday, talking about the Phoenix pay system that's left government workers overpaid, underpaid, not paid at all. The price tag for fixing it likely going to blow past the government's projection of about $500 million and land closer to double that, $1 billion. So who better to weigh in on all this and much more at issue, of course. Andrew is in Toronto tonight, Chantal in Montreal, and Paul Wells is joining us from Ottawa. Andrew, at what point do the Liberals have to stop calling this a Conservative problem, and at what point do they start wearing it?
I don't know is the short answer. I'm sure there's shared blame here. There's no doubt this thing was pretty flawed from the beginning, but at some point the Liberals decided to flick the switch and go live with it. And look, at some point, for any government, your job is to fix the mistakes and messes left by previous governments. That's part of the definition of your role and responsibility. I do think, however, that the larger significance of this is less to do with one party or another, or one government or another, but systemic. Governments seem to have a lot of problem with IT projects to begin with, whether you're talking about the Canada.ca, or the Long Gun Registry, or the Ontario eHealth. And if you look at the long and the short of that is, governments are so enormous, they're so complex, there's so many collective bargaining agreements, so many unions, so many employers, so many work rules. It's gotten way too large for any human being, any human organization to manage in an efficient way.
Chantal.
It kind of makes you shudder at the mess that some provinces might make of the sale of cannabis when you think of the incapacity of governments to do basic things properly. Bottom line, though, unless this is fixed, the Liberals, whether that's fair or not, because they didn't start it, will end up wearing it in the next election, not because most Canadians are touched by this problem, but because it stands to become kind of a symbol of an incapacity to resolve issues, and there's very little that is more basic than getting people that work for you their paychecks.
Yeah, and I mean, we're on the third minister now to try and solve it, because Ralph Goodale had it for a period of time, and still no one's been fired, Paul. And that to me is like, I understand it's hard to fire unionized employees, but someone should take responsibility for it, and still that hasn't happened.
Yeah, I mean, if the Liberals are guilty of anything, it's a kind of extended bout of wishful thinking. The Auditor General chronicles a period, almost as soon as this government was elected, they were giving frequent briefings on the state of the Phoenix pay system, but it turns out they were essentially kidding themselves about the real scale of the problem. It was worse than they said. It was worse than they admitted to themselves, and it's going to take far more resources than they have admitted even to date. And meanwhile, every week, for dozens of kilometers in every direction outside of Ottawa, large portions of the population are either getting underpaid or they're getting overpaid and will be asked to pay the money, the extra money back. And so this thing grinds week after week. Most public servants that I talk to have had Phoenix pay problems.
Okay, I want to switch, if I can, to the housing announcement this week, because it was part of the election platform, so you would expect them to deliver, but there may be some issues there. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say.
We'll be working closely with the provinces and territories to make sure that affordable housing remains a key, achievable priority. To help them execute an ambitious housing agenda, we'll be investing nearly $20 billion in provincial and territorial housing programs over 12 years.
So the part that he's not mentioning there is that provinces have to pony up cash as well. Chantal, is this as significant as it seems if we don't know that provinces are going to do this or not?
Well, I think it's significant in the sense that it has been years, more than a decade, not just in social housing, but since the federal government has been upfront about a social measure of that magnitude. Mm-hmm. Whether it's going to work is very much an open question. They're going to have to negotiate this with people who may not be as friendly to them as the current provincial governments. Quebec has already said it wants a deal that respects its capacity to manage the file. There may be new governments in Ontario or Alberta or elsewhere who are going to say maybe that's not our priority or not the way we want to go.
Yeah, I wondered, Andrew, too, how much of this was a play to the progressive left that they courted throughout the election campaign. Like they had to do this because a lot of people inside the NDP and other sort of left-leaning parties, more left-leaning parties, would have said this is central to what you have to get done.
This is sort of a common theme with this government, isn't it? Is they sort of throw their hat over the wall and then they figure out later how they're going to retrieve it. It is a question in my mind, what exactly about housing it recommends itself to federal a role in it, with the exception of the housing benefit, which is designed to be portable, and you want people to be able to move from province to province. But buildings themselves seems to be much more a local and provincial responsibility. And we've seen this movie before, where the feds get into these shared cost programs with the provinces, where they distort the provinces' priorities. They might have, as Chantal mentioned, other things they want to do with the same money, with equally pressing priorities. And you get into the same finger pointing and blurred accountability. You know, we really need to be going in the opposite direction, in my view, of having governments much more accountable to their own taxpayers for raising their own funds and spending their own funds, rather than these shared cost programs.
Yeah, Paul.
I don't want to be too down on this proposal. The devil's in the detail.
You're allowed to applaud it. You're allowed to applaud it.
We spent the first half of this panel talking about how often the devil is in the details. But if this thing were to work as the feds hope, it would be one of the best things that they've done. It's exceedingly rare that any government in the last 20 years has put a large amount of money into fixing the problems of the poorest Canadians. There's way too much preoccupation on the supposedly forgotten middle class. But when you help the poorest Canadians find housing, you have substantial public health benefits and substantial benefits on reducing crime over the long term. And so I think that's why a lot of big city mayors were very pleased to hear this, because they've been praying for an intervention on this scale for some time.
But Andrew's point is a good one, because I think, Paul, what you're saying about the mayors, they did want it. I've talked to Gregor Robertson about this, I don't know how many hundreds of times. So they did want it, but should they not be leading the charge rather than maybe just taking the money and walking off and figuring out how to solve it?
Right. I mean, there's a distinction between what's the role of government and what's the role of the federal government. There may well be a role for the government in these respects. As I say, I do want to say, I think the housing benefit, the portable, give cash to people, let them find their own housing with the federal cash, that's good, because that does involve a federal idea that you want people to be able to move from province to province. The rest of it, I'm not so sure.
And then there's the history of it, and it's also the history of Medicare. The federal government steps in and says, here, we've got these billions, come and join us. And then when finances get tight, and they might federally, they just pull out, which is how the federal government acted with social housing at the time of the let's balance the books era under Jean Chrétien. So for
okay,
the
but
provinces,
if that was a bad thing for them to do, then we should be a little bit easier on them when they unpull out, which is what they've just done.
Yes, but if you force provinces to commit to a program and then you walk away, or you say, well, my share unilaterally, which is how they've acted with Medicare and how they acted with social housing, it doesn't make for provinces to say, let's buy into this great program that we will be left to sustain when they decide that they should balance their books.
All right, there's a hockey rink on Parliament Hill. No, really, there is. And it's cost more than $5 million. Initially, it was just going to happen for a couple of weeks. And now it's going to be extended until February, as we talked about earlier in the show. But the minister behind this is Mélanie Joly, because she has the Canada 150 money that she's been doling out throughout the year. This was supposed to be a nice idea for Canadians as the year comes to a close. Paul, is this... I mean, you don't have to talk about the hockey rink, but is this damaging for Mélanie Joly, who's been under fire and pressure for all these other things happening right now as well?
Personally, I've been mood swinging on this hockey rink for a while. At first, my first reaction was, this is in Ottawa. It's 2 or 3 blocks away from the longest naturally occurring ice surface in North America, which is the Rideau Canal. But thanks to climate change, Rideau Canal isn't open for very long. So then I thought it was a good idea. Then I found out about the price, more than $5 million for something that won't be open for more than several weeks. And that gets back to what's become a recurring theme in Justin Trudeau's Ottawa, never mind Melanie Joly, which is that nobody ever says that any proposed idea is a bad use of the next taxpayer dollar. When I think of what that $5 million could have been used for in almost any other purpose, including being left in our wallets, I get a little conservative.
Okay, Andrew.
Every time I encounter these kinds of things, I'm just baffled. I don't know how you possibly spend $5 million to build an outdoor rink. I mean, what are the costs? You need water. You need some wood.
There are stands. It's because there are stands.
Okay,
you can go
but
and watch
$5 million.
and apply.
Or how do you spend $200,000 on a budget cover? Or how do you spend $34 million renovating the Prime Minister's house? I can't give any useful insight on this because it's just utterly baffling.
But it's very Canadian. It does look nice, Chantal.
Yes, except I'm with Paul. There is the Rideau Canal. I'm assuming if it gets really warm at the end of December, they're going to find a way to maintain the ice. For Mélanie Joly, I think there are two issues. Yes, everything she touches seems to kind of not turn out to be the roaring success that she expects, which means she's not maybe thinking ahead to consequences. But the other thing is the way of the announcement to say, I'm spending all this money, but gee, I'm closing this down on January 1st. Surely someone somewhere might have said, hello, if we're going to spend all this money to put this in, should we not try to have it there for a while, rather than have to go back to the drawing board in the face of a social media tempest and say, okay, we're going to keep it. So it comes across as poorly thought out, and I think it's dangerous for Madame Joly to be seen as the minister of the ice rink, sorry, not hockey rink, no hockey.
Paul, do you think, though, that this is that Minister Joly has sort of lapsed into Minister of Damage Control? Something gets announced, then she sort of has to attempt to fix it. Something gets announced, she has to attempt to fix it.
I think I was speaking earlier about wishful thinking. I think this is part of the problem, and because she's the Minister of Canadian Heritage, she's the Minister of wishful thinking, especially around Canada 150. Look, most Canadians don't care that we're halfway between the last meaningful anniversary and the next meaningful anniversary, and they didn't think that we should spend a lot of money on this one. And most Canadians aren't excited about Parliament Hill because they're not there. And yet I can almost picture the round table discussion where they gin themselves up into thinking this would be just great and that people would just think it was great. And it turns out that some people don't. And all I can say is, we've seen this film before, and I'm afraid we're going to see it again.
And don't forget, you're gonna have to reserve your time online to go on it. So forget about saying, why don't we just go to Parliament Hill and bring our skates? That's not happening.
Okay, Andrew, last word.
If they were spending their own money, I guarantee you they would not be spending $5 million building a hockey rink, an outdoor temporary hockey rink.
Hockey.
It's a tiny, or
Ice
a
rink.
skating rink. It's a tiny pinprick in the $300 billion plus of federal spending, but part of the reason you get to $300 billion in spending is 1,000 different things like this.
I feel like everyone's going to think we're just grumpy and don't like ice skates, but that's fine. We'll leave it there. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. That's At Issue for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week. So long.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.